Let's start with the war in Ukraine, which has gone on a lot longer than certainly I think President Putin thought it would. Now we hear that they're calling up another 137,000 troops. What does that tell us about the future of that war?
Well, I think it tells us that Putin recognizes that he doesn't have enough recruits to replace the losses in Ukraine and perform other missions that they still attend to around the world. But most significantly, it's about, again, having the additional forces that are needed in Ukraine, where they've taken very, very heavy losses. They have, for a period of time, they were losing more each day, and these are actual losses, not just wounded, than we lost in an entire month in the worst year of the surge in Iraq. So he has a real challenge on his hand, but without mobilizing the country for war, which he does not want to do because of concern over domestic issues associated with that. He's trying to do this in a way that skirts that, still calls this a special operation, but still provides the forces needed. And I think many observers that focus on this intently believe that this is much more aspirational than it is going to be realistic. He will not be able to raise the additional forces. He's actually struggling now just with the recruits to bring them in, again, to replace the losses that they're having on the battlefield. And of course, at this moment, at this 6-month mark, Russia has achieved nothing like what I'm sure Putin and his generals expected they would have achieved. Of course, they didn't achieve their main objective, which was to take Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, and topple the government, replace President Zelensky with a pro-Russian figure. They had to withdraw from there and 2 other major northern cities. They weren't able to take Kharkiv, the #2 city in Ukraine, very close to the border. Those forces have been pushed back out of artillery range of the city. They did expand their holdings in the southeast and the south, but now they're really grinding to a halt in their efforts to expand on those. So Russia's in a tough position. And meanwhile, you have Ukraine, which is supported not just by the arsenal of democracy, the United States, with another $3 billion worth of assistance just the other day, taking this up to well over $13 billion just since January of 2021. Yeah, but they're also supported by all the other NATO countries and most other Western countries around the world as well. And so that's very important because you do have on the battlefield a war of attrition, if you will, but there's another war or competition that's ongoing, and that's the force generation competition. And in this regard, Ukraine is much more impressive and effective and efficient in recruiting, training, organizing, equipping, and employing new forces and capabilities than is Russia. And in fact, they've been using some of the systems that we've provided very effectively, these precise rockets and precise artillery rounds, to take out the Russian ammo supply points, Russian fuel depots, Russian headquarters, Russian assembly areas, and even the Russian airfields in the Crimean Peninsula. So nowhere now is really safe for the Russians on territory that once was Ukrainian, and they're having to withdraw some of their assets all the way back to Russia proper. What that means is that it's much more challenging for Russia now to logistically support their troops on the front line as Ukraine is trying to isolate those, particularly those that are just west of the Dnipro River in the southern part of the country around the city of Kherson, Kherson, where we expect to see at some point a counteroffensive launched by the Ukrainians.
General, you mentioned war of attrition. And now for those of us for a very great distance, it looks like it's sort of in stasis. Nobody's moving much either way. You're a student of war. What gets it out of stasis? And let me ask you one specific question. Could the energy crunch come winter with natural gas, particularly going into Western Europe, Germany, could that actually move over to the Russians' advantage?
Well, certainly it causes challenges in Europe, and particularly significant countries there. Germany has a particular challenge with the very, very dramatic increase in electricity prices, as you know. That could cause real issues. That could cause industrial challenges and all the rest of this. And so there is a concern about the solidity of the alliance in the winter. But I don't think, actually, that you're going to see that crack. The U.S. is going to remain very firm. We're still using the very, very substantial amount of resources that were approved by Congress and signed into law by the president several months ago. Those will carry us all the way through the end of this year, I would suspect. And so you're going to see Ukraine benefiting from that. And really, what's very significant now, David, I think, is that the Ukrainians, for the first time, have actually seized the strategic initiative. In other words, for the first time, you see the Russians actually responding a fair amount to what the Ukrainians are doing, particularly in the south, where, as I mentioned, they're trying to isolate these forces on the west side of the Dnipro River. They've literally taken out all the bridges and they've taken out the logistical elements that support those forces and so forth. And at some point, you're going to see them try to retake that particular area, which will be very significant. The challenge, of course, is that the offensive is much more difficult than is the defensive, as the Russians have found out trying to take out very, very skillful defensive operations by the Ukrainians. Now the Ukrainians have to do that, and going into urban areas can be very costly.
Yeah, just ask General Lee at Gettysburg, as I recall. He learned something about defense versus offensive. One more here, if I could, General. It is the first anniversary of that awful bombing that killed the Marines in Kabul in the midst of what I thought was a somewhat chaotic withdrawal from the United States from Afghanistan. What effects, continuing lingering effects, if any, does that have on U.S. policy and also on our allies' reaction to our ability to stay the course?
Well, I think one of the issues that arose from the decision to withdraw and then the way the withdrawal was conducted, on the one hand, and it was a logistical marvel, pulling 120,000 individuals out of an embattled capital. On the other hand, it was, as you say, quite chaotic in execution. And so that allowed some of our would-be adversaries to say, see, we told you, you can't depend on the Americans. They are not a dependable ally or partner. And look at this, how they've executed this. They're a great power in decline. Now, I think, actually, David, that we have put that at least into the rearview mirror. It's still visible. It still is out there. But because of the very impressive way we have supported Ukraine against this unprovoked Russian invasion, the way we have gathered our allies together, with the way we've guided the implementation of the various financial, economic, and personal sanctions, the export controls, et cetera, and also the very impressive counterterrorism operations that took out the head of al-Qaeda and also the head of the Islamic State in Syria, that all of these have, I think, again, pushed that back in further into the rearview mirror, although it is still there. But I think over time, we'll see that was a bit of a one-off. Certainly, the others of us certainly wish we had kept forces there. There was a way you could have a sustained presence. That was not the decision, and so that's where we are. The implications of that, number one, are that, of course, as we've seen, we have to keep an eye on the possibility of Islamist extremists in Afghanistan. And the worrisome element is not actually al-Qaeda. It's actually the Islamic State, which is carrying out really horrific attacks there, similar to what they were doing in Syria in the early days of their establishment of a caliphate there. I don't think they'll establish a caliphate. I don't think they'll have an international effect, but that is one that bears very careful watching. And I know that we are watching that indeed very carefully.